Subspace Survivors by E.E Smith, Chapter 1. This is a librivox recording. All librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Juliana M. There has always been, and will always be, the problem of surviving the experience that any trained expert can handle when there hasn't been any first survivor to be an expert, when no one has ever gotten back to explain what happened. All passengers, will you pay attention, please? All the high-fidelity speakers of the starship Procyon spoke as one in the skillfully modulated voice of the trained announcer. This is the fourth and last cautionary announcement. Any who are not seated will seat themselves at once. Prepare for takeoff acceleration of 1 1/2 gravities. That is, everyone will weigh 1/2 again as much as his normal Earth weight for about 15 minutes. We lift in 20 seconds. I will count down the final 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, lift! The immense vessel rose from her berth, slowly at first, but with ever-increasing velocity, and in the main lounge, where many of the passengers had gathered to watch the dwindling Earth, no one moved for the first 5 minutes. Then a girl stood up. She was not a startlingly beautiful girl, no more than can be seen fairly often of a summer afternoon on Seaside Beach. Her hair was an artificial yellow, her eyes were a deep, cool blue, her skin, what could be seen of it, she was wearing breeches and a long-sleeve shirt, was lightly tanned. She was only about 5 feet 3, and her build was not spectacular. However, every ounce of her 115 pounds was exactly where it should have been. First, she stood tentatively, flexing her knees and testing her weight. Then, stepping boldly out into a clear space, she began to do a high-kicking aerobatic dance, and went on doing it as effortlessly and as rhythmically as though she were on an earthly stage. "You mustn't do that, miss." A stewardess came bustling up, or rather, not exactly bustling. Very few people, and almost no stewardesses, either actually bustle in or really enjoy 1.5 Gs. "You really must resume your seat, miss. I must insist. Oh, you're Miss Warner." She paused. "That's right, Barbara Warner, cabin 281. But really, Miss Warner, it's regulations, and if you should fall—" "Foosh to regulations, and poof on 'em. I won't fall. I've been wondering, every time out, if I could do a thing, and now I'm going to find out." Jackknifing double, she put both forearms flat on the carpet and lifted both legs into the vertical. Then, silver slippers pointing motionlessly ceilingward, she got up onto her hands and walked twice around a vacant chair. She then performed a series of flips that would have done credit to a professional acrobat, the finale of which left her sitting calmly in the previously empty seat. "See," she informed the flabbergasted stewardess, "I could do it, and I didn't." Her voice was drowned out in a yell of approval, as everyone who could clap their hands did so with enthusiasm. "More! Keep it up, gal! Do it again!" "Oh, I didn't do that to show off." Barbara Warner flushed hotly as she met the eyes of the nearby spectators. "Honestly, I didn't. I just had to know if I could." Then, as the applause did not die down, she fairly scampered out of the room. For 1 hour before the Procyon's departure from Earth, and for 3 hours afterward, First Officer Carlyle Destin, Chief Electronicist, sat attentively at his board. He was 5 foot 8 inches tall and weighed 162 pounds net, just a little guy as spacemen go. Although narrow-waisted and, for his heft, broad-shouldered, he was built for speed and maneuverability, not to haul freight. Watching 100 lights and half that many instruments, listening to 2 phone circuits, one with each ear, and hands moving from switches to rheostats to buttons and levers, He was completely informed as to the instant-by-instant status of everything in his department. Although attentive, he was not tense, even during the countdown. The only change was that at the word 2, his right forefinger came to rest upon a red button, and his eyes doubled their rate of scan. If anything in his department had gone wrong, the Procyon's departure would have been delayed. And again, well out beyond the orbit of the moon, just before the starship's mighty Chator engines hurtled her out of space as we know it, into that unknowable something that is hyperspace, he poised a finger. But emergence, too, was normal. All the green lights except one went out, needles dropped to 0, both phones went dead, all signals stopped. He plugged a jack into a socket below the one remaining green light and spoke. Procyon 1 to Control 6, Flight 849, Subspace Radio Test 1, how do you read me, Control 6? Control 6 to Procyon 1, I read you 10 and 0, how do you read me, Procyon 1? 10 and 0, out. Destin flipped a toggle, and the solitary green light went out. Perfect signal and 0 noise. That was that. From now until emergence, unless something happened, he might as well be a passenger. Everything was automatic, unless and until some robot or computer yelled for help. Destin leaned back in his bucket seat and lighted a cigarette. He didn't need to scan the board constantly now. Any trouble signal would jump right out at him. Promptly at D plus 300, 3 hours, no minutes, no seconds after departure, his relief appeared. All black, babe? The newcomer asked. As the pit, Eddie. Take over. Eddie did so. You've picked out your girlfriend for the trip, I suppose? Not yet. I got sidetracked watching Bobby Warner. She was doing handstands and handwalks and forward and back flips in the lounge. Under 1.5 Gs yet. Wow. And after that, all the other women looked like a dime's worth of cat meat. She doesn't stand out too much until she starts to move, but then, oh brother! Eddie rolled his eyes, made motions with his hands, and whistled expressively. Talk about poetry in motion. Just walking across a stage she'd bring down the house and stop the show cold in its tracks. Okay, don't blow a fuse, Destin said resignedly. I know, you'll love her undyingly all this trip, maybe, so bring her up next watch, and I'll give her a gold badge, as usual. How dumb can you get? Eddie demanded. Do you think I'd even try to play footsie with Barbara Warner? You'd play footsie with the Archangel Michael's sister if she'd let you, and she probably would. So who's Barbara Warner? Eddie Thompson gazed at his superior pityingly. I know you're 10.9% monk, babe, but I did think you pulled your nose out of the megacycles often enough to learn a few of the facts of life. Did you ever hear of Warner Oil? I think so. Destin thought for a moment. Found a big new field, didn't they? In South America somewhere? Just the biggest on Earth is all. And not only on Earth, he operates in all the systems for 100 parsecs around, and he never sinks a dry hole. Every well he drills is a gusher that blows the rig clear up into the stratosphere. Everybody wonders how he does it. My guess is that his wife's an oil witch, which is why he lugs his whole family along wherever he goes. Why else would he? Maybe he loves her. It happens, you know. Huh? Eddie snorted. After 20 years of her? Comet gas. Anyway, would you have the sublime gall to make passes at Warner Oil's heiress, with more millions in her own sock than you've got dimes? I don't make passes. That's right, you don't. Only at books and tapes, even on ground leaves. More fool you. Well then, would you marry anybody like that? Certainly, if I loved. Destin paused, thought a moment, then went on. Maybe I wouldn't either. She'd make me dress for dinner. She'd probably have a live waiter, maybe even a butler. So I guess I wouldn't at that. You nor me neither, brother. But what a dish! What a lovely, luscious, toothsome dish! Eddie mourned. You'll be raving about another one tomorrow, Destin said unfeelingly, as he turned away. I don't know. But even if I do, she won't be anything like her, Eddie said to the closing door. And Destin, outside the door, grinned sardonically to himself. Before his next watch, Eddie would bring up one of the prettiest girls aboard for a gold badge, the token that would let her, under approved escort of course, go through the top. He himself never went down to the middle, which was passenger territory. There was nothing there he wanted. He was too busy, had too many worthwhile things to do, to waste time that way. But the hunch was getting stronger and stronger all the time. For the first time in all his 3 years of deep space service, he felt an overpowering urge to go down into the very middle of the middle, to the starship's main lounge. He knew that his hunches were infallible. At cards, dice, or wheels, he had always had hunches, and he had always won. That was why he had stopped gambling, years before anybody found out. He was that kind of a man. Apart from the matter of unearned increment, however, he always followed his hunches. But this one he did not like at all. He had been resisting it for hours, because he had never visited the lounge and did not want to visit it now. But something down there was pulling like a tractor, so he went. He didn't go to his cabin, didn't even take off his sidearm. He didn't even think of it. The .41 automatic at his hip was as much a part of his uniform as his pants. Entering the lounge, he did not have to look around. She was playing bridge, and as eyes met eyes and she rose to her feet, a shock wave swept through him that made him feel as though his every hair was standing straight on end. "Excuse me, please," she said to the other 3 at her table. "I must go now." She tossed her cards down onto the table and walked straight toward him, eyes still holding eyes. He backed hastily out into the corridor, and as the door closed behind her, they went naturally and wordlessly into each other's arms. Lips met lips in a kiss that lasted for a long, long time. It was not a passionate embrace. Passion would come later. It was as though each of them, after endless years of bootless, fruitless longing, had come finally home. "Come with me, dear, where we can talk," she said, finally eyeing with disfavor the half-dozen highly interested spectators. And a couple of minutes later, in cabin 281, Destin said, "So this is why I had to come down into passenger territory. You came aboard at exactly 0743. She shook her yellow head. "A few minutes before that. That was when I read your name in the list of officers on the board. First Officer Carlyle Destin. I got a tingle that went from the tips of my toes up and out through the very ends of my hair. Nothing like when we actually saw each other, of course. We both knew the truth then. It's wonderful that you're so strongly psychic, too." "I don't know about that," he said thoughtfully. "All my training has been based on the axiomatic fact that the map is not the territory. Psionics, as I understand it, holds that the map is, practically, the territory, but can't prove it. So I simply don't know what to believe. On one hand, I have had real hunches all my life. On the other, the signal doesn't carry much information. More like hearing a siren when you're driving along a street. You know you have to pull over and stop, but that's all you know. It could be police, fire ambulance, anything. Anybody with psionic ability at all ought to be able to do a lot better than that, I should think." "Not necessarily. You've been fighting it. 99% of your mind doesn't want to believe it, is dead set against it. So it has to force its way through billions and skillions of ohms of resistance, so only the most powerful stimuli, maximum signal in your jargon perhaps, can get through to you at all." Suddenly she giggled like a schoolgirl. "You're either psychic or the biggest wolf in the known universe, and I know you aren't a wolf. If you hadn't been as psychic as I am, you'd have jumped clear out into subspace when a perfectly strange girl attacked you." "How do you know so much about me?" "I made it a point to. One of the juniors told me you're the only virgin officer in all space." "That was Eddie Thompson." "Uh-huh," she nodded brightly. "Well, is that bad?" "Anything else but. That is, he thought it was terrible. Outrageous, a betrayal of the whole officer caste. But to me it makes everything just absolutely perfect. Me too. How soon can we get married? I'd say right now, except... She caught her lower lip between her teeth and thought. No, no except. Right now or as soon as you can. You can't without resigning, can you? They'd fire you. Don't worry about that, he grinned. My record is good enough, I think, to get a good ground job, even if they fire me for not waiting until we ground. There's lots of jobs. I can support you, sweetheart. Oh, I know you can. I wasn't thinking of that. You wouldn't like a ground job. What difference does that make? He asked, in honest surprise. A man grows up. I couldn't have you with me in space, and I'd like that a lot less. No, I'm done with space as of now. But what was that accept business? I thought at first I'd tell my parents first. They're both aboard. But I decided not to. She'd scream bloody murder and he'd roar like a lion, and none of it would make me change my mind, so we'll get married first. He looked at her questioningly. She shrugged and went on. We aren't what you'd call a happy family. She's been trying to make me marry an old goat of a prince, and I finally told her to go roll her hoop, to get a divorce and marry the foul old beast herself. And to consolidate two empires, he's been wanting me to marry a multi-billionaire who is also a louse and a crumb and a heel. Last week he insisted on it, and I blew up like an atomic bomb. I told him if I got married 1,000 times, I'd pick every one of my husbands myself, without the least bit of help from either him or her. I'll keep on finding oil and stuff for him, I said, but that was all. Oil? Destin exclaimed, involuntarily, as everything fell into place in his mind. The way she walked, poetry in motion, the oil witch, 2 empires, more millions than he had dimes. Oh, you're Barbara Warner, then. Why, of course. But my friends call me Bobby. Didn't you? But, of course, you didn't. You never read passenger lists. If you did, you'd have got a tingle, too. I got plenty of tingle without reading, believe me. However, I never expected to. Don't say it, dear. She got up and took both of his hands in hers. I know how you feel. I don't like to let you ruin your career either, but nothing can separate us now that we've found each other. So I'll tell you this. Her eyes looked steadily into his. If it bothers you the least bit, later on, I'll give every dollar I own to some foundation or other. I swear it. He laughed shamefacedly as he took her into his arms. Since that's the way you look at it, it won't bother me a bit. Uh-huh, you do mean it. She snuggled her head down into the curve of his neck. I can tell. I know you can, sweetheart. Then he had another thought, and with strong, deft fingers, he explored the muscles of her arms and back. But those aerobatics in plus G, and you're trained down as hard and fine as I am, and it's my business to be. How come? I majored in physical education, and I love it. And I'm a new Martian, you know, so I teach a few courses. New Martian? I've heard. But you aren't a colonial. You're as Terran as I am. By blood, yes. But I was born on New Mars. Our actual and legal residence has always been there. The tax situation, you know. I don't know. No. Taxes don't bother me much. But go ahead. You teach a few courses? In? Oh, bars, trapeze, ground and lofty tumbling, aerobatics, aerialistics, high wire, muscle control, judo, all that kind of thing. Ouch. So if you ever happen to accidentally get mad at me, you'll tie me right up into a pretzel? I doubt it, very seriously. I've tossed lots of 200-pounders around, of course, but they were not space officers. She laughed unaffectedly as she tested his musculature much more professionally and much more thoroughly than he had tested hers. Definitely I couldn't. A good big man can always take a good little one, you know. But I'm not big. I'm just a little squirt. You've probably heard what they call me. Yes, and I'm going to call you Babe, too, and mean it the same way they do. Besides, who wants a man a foot taller than she is, and twice as big? You're just exactly the right size. That's spreading the good old oil, Bobby, but I'll never tangle with you if I can help it. Buzzsaws are small, too, and sticks of dynamite. Shall we go hunt up the parson? Or should it be a priest? Or a rabbi? Even that doesn't make a particle of difference to you. Of course not. How could it? A parson, please. Then, with a bright, quick grin, we have got a lot to learn about each other, haven't we? Some details, of course, but nothing of any importance, and we'll have plenty of time to learn them. And we'll love every second of it. You'll live down here in the middle with me, won't you, all the time you aren't actually on duty? I can't imagine doing anything else. And the two set out, arms around each other, to find a minister, and as they strolled along, of course, you won't actually need a job, ever, or my money either. You never even thought of dowsing, did you? Dowsing? Oh, that witch stuff. Of course not. Listen, darling. All the time I've been touching you, I've been learning about you, and you've been learning about me. Yes, but... No buts, Buster. You have really tremendous powers, and they aren't latent either. All you have to do is quit fighting them and use them. You're ever so much stronger and fuller than I am. All I can do at dowsing is find water, oil, coal, and gas. I'm no good at all on metals. I couldn't feel gold if I were perched right on the roof of Fort Knox. I couldn't feel radium if it were frying me to a crisp. But I'm positive that you can tune yourself to anything you want to find. He didn't believe it, and the argument went on until they reached the Reverend's quarters. Then, of course, it was dropped automatically, and the next 5 days were deliciously, deliriously, ecstatically happy days for them both. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Subspace Survivors by E.E Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At the time of this chronicle, the status of interstellar flight was very similar to that of intercontinental jet plane flight in the 1960s. Starships were designed by humanity's best brains, carried every safety device those brains could devise. They were maintained and serviced by ultra-skilled, ultra-trained, ultra-able crews. They were operated by the crème de la crème of manhood. Only a man with an extremely capable mind and an extremely capable body could become an officer of a subspacer. Statistically, starships were the safest means of transportation ever used by man. So safe that very important persons use them regularly, unthinkingly, and as a matter of course. Statistically, the starship's fatality rate per million passenger light years was a small fraction of that of the automobile's per million passenger miles. Insurance companies offered odds of tens of thousands to 1 that any given star traveler would return unharmed from any given star trip he cared to make. Nevertheless, accidents happened. A chillingly large number of lives had, as a total, been lost, and no catastrophe had ever been even partially explained. No message of distress or call for help had ever been received. No single survivor had ever been found, nor any piece of wreckage. And on the great wheel of fate, the Procyon's number came up. In the middle of the night, Carlyle Destin came instantaneously awake, feeling with his every muscle and with his every square inch of skin, listening with all the force he could put into his auditory nerves, while deep down in his mind a huge, terribly silent voice continued to yell, "Danger! Danger! Danger!" In a very small fraction of a second, Carlyle Destin moved, and fast. Seizing Barbara by an arm, he leaped out of bed with her. "We're abandoning ship. Get into the suit, quick!" "But what? But I've got to dress!" "No time, snap it up!" He practically hurled her into her suit, clamped her helmet tight, then he leaped into his own. "Skipper!" he snapped into the suit's microphone. "Destin! Emergency! Abandon ship!" The alarm bells clanged once. The big red lights flashed once. The sirens barely started to growl, then quit. The whole vast fabric of the ship trembled and shuddered and shook as though it were being mauled by 1,000 impossibly gigantic hammers. Destin did not know, and never did find out, whether it was his captain or an automatic that touched off the alarm. Whichever it was, the disaster happened so fast that practically no warning at all was given. And out in the corridor, "Come on, girls, sprint!" He put his arm under hers and urged her along. She did her best, but in comparison with his trained performance, her best wasn't good. "I've never been checked out on sprinting in spacesuits," she gasped. "Let go of me and go on ahead. I'll follow." Everything went out. Lights, gravity, air circulation, everything. "You haven't been checked out on free fall either. Hang on to this tool hanger here on my belt and we'll travel." "Where to?" she asked, hurling through the air much faster than she had ever gone on foot. "Baby 2, that is, Lifecraft number 2, my crash assignment. Good thing I was down here in the middle. I'd never had made it from up top. Next corridor left, I think." Then, as the light of his headlamp showed numbers on the wall, "Yes, square left. I'll swing you." He swung her, and they shot to the end of the passage. He kicked a lever, and the Lifecraft's port swung open, to reveal a blaze of light and a startled gray-haired man. "What happened? The man began. "Wrecked. We've had it. We're abandoning ship. Get into that cubby over there. Shut the door tight behind you, and stay there." "But can't I do something to help?" "Without a suit and not knowing how to use one? You'd get burned to a cinder. Get in there and jump." The oldster jumped, and Destin turned to his wife. "Stay here at the port, Bobby. Wrap one leg around that lever to anchor you. What does your telltale read? That gauge there, your radiation meter? It reads 20, same as mine. Just pink. So we've got a minute or so. I'll roust out some passengers and toss 'em to you. You toss 'em along in there. Can do?" She was white and trembling. She was very evidently on the verge of being violently sick, but she was far from being out of control. "Can do, sir." "Good girl, sweetheart. Hang on 1 minute more and we'll have gravity and you'll be okay." The first 5 doors he tried were locked, and since they were made of armor plate, there was nothing he could do about them except give each one a resounding kick with a heavy steel boot. The 6th was unlocked, but the passengers, a man and a woman, were very evidently and very gruesomely dead. So was everyone else he could find, until he came to a room in which a man in a spacesuit was floundering helplessly in the air. He glanced at his telltale. 32, high in the red, almost against the pin. "Bobby, what do you read?" 26. "Good. I found only one, but we're running out of time. I'm coming in." In the Lifecraft, he closed the port and slammed on full drive away from the ship. Then, wheeling, he shook Barbara out of her suit like an ear of corn and shed his own. He picked up a fire extinguisher-like affair and jerked open the door of a room a little larger than a clothes closet. "Jump in here." He slammed the door shut. "Now strip, quick." He picked the canister up and twisted 4 valves. Before he could get the gun into working position, she was out of her pajamas. The fact that she had been wondering visibly what it was all about had done nothing whatever to cut down her speed. A flood of thick, creamy foam almost hid her from sight, and Destin began to talk, quietly. "Thanks, sweetheart, for not slowing us down by arguing and wanting explanations. This stuff is decon, short for decontaminant, complete, compound, absorbent, and chelating, type DCQ-429. Used soon enough, it takes care of radiation. Rub it in good, all over you, like this." He set the foam gun down on the floor and went vigorously to work. "Yes, hair too. Every square millimeter of skin and mucous membrane. Yes, into your eyes. It stings 'em a little, but that's a lot better than going blind. And your mouth. Swallow 6 good big mouthfuls. It's tasteless and goes down easy. Now the soles of your feet. Okay. The last will hurt plenty, but we've got to get some of it into your lungs, and we can't do it the hospital way. So when I slap a glob of it over your mouth and nose, inhale hard and deep. Just once is all anybody can do, but that's enough. And don't fight. Any ordinary woman I could handle, but I can't handle you fast enough. So if you don't inhale deep, I'll have to knock you cold, otherwise you'll die of lung cancer. Will do? Will do, sweetheart. Good and deep, no fight. And she emptied her lungs. He slapped it on, she inhaled good and deep, and went into convulsive paroxysms of coughing. He held her in his arms until the worst of it was over, but she was still coughing hard when she pulled herself away from him. But how about you? She could just barely talk. Her voice was distorted, almost inaudible. Let me help you, quick. No need, darling. 2 other men out there. The old man probably won't need it. I think I got him into the safe quick enough. The other guy and I will help each other. So lie down there on the bunk and take it easy until I come back here and help you get the gum cock off. So long for half an hour, pet. 45 minutes later, while all 4 were still cleaning up the messes of foam, something began to buzz sharply. Destin stepped over to the board and flipped a switch. The communicator came on. Since everything aboard a starship is designed to fail safe, they were, of course, in normal space. On the visiplates, hundreds of stars blazed in vari-colored points of hard, bright light. Baby 2 acknowledging, Destin said. First Officer Destin and 3 passengers. Decon to 0. Report, please. Baby 3. Second Officer Jones and 4 passengers. Decon to... Thank God, Herc. Formality vanished. With you to astrogate us, we may have a chance. But how'd you make it? I'd have sworn a flying saucer couldn't have gotten down from the top in the time we had. Same thing right back at you, babe. I didn't have to come down. We were in Baby 3 when it happened. Full vision was on. A big, square-jawed, lean, tanned face looked out at them from the screen. Huh? How come? And who's we? My wife and I. Second Officer Theodore Hercules Jones was somewhat embarrassed. I got married too, day before yesterday. After the way the old man chewed you out, though, I knew he'd slap irons on me without saying a word. So we kept it dark and hid out in Baby 3. These 3 are all we could find before our meters went high red. I deconned Bun, then... Bun? Barbara broke in. Bernice Burns? How wonderful! Formerly Bernice Burns. The face of a platinum blonde beauty appeared on the screen beside Jones. And am I glad to see you, Barbara, even if I did just meet you yesterday. I didn't know whether I'd ever see another girl's face or not. Let's cut the chat, Destin said then. Herc, give me a course, blast, and time for rendezvous. Hey, my watch stopped. So did mine, Jones said. So just hold 1 gravity on 18-47-271, and I'll correct you as necessary. After setting course, and still thinking of his watch, Destin said, But it's non-magnetic. It never stopped before. The gray-haired man spoke. It was never in such a field before. You see, those 2 observations of fact invalidate 24 of the 38 best theories of hyperspace. But tell me, am I correct in saying that none of you were in direct contact with the metal of the ship when it happened? We avoid it in case of trouble. You, name and job? Destin jerked his head at the younger stranger. I know that much. Henry Newman, crew chief, normal space jobs, unlimited. Your passengers, Herc? Vince Lepresto, financier, and his 2 bodyguards. They were sleeping in their suits, on air mattresses. Grounders, don't like subspace, or space either. Just so. The gray-haired man nodded, almost happily. We survivors, then, absorbed the charge gradually. But what the... Destin began. 1 moment, please, young man. You perhaps saw some of the bodies. What were they like? They looked, well, not exactly as though they had exploded, but... He paused. Precisely, Gray Hair beamed. That eliminates all the others except 3. Morton's, Sebring's, and Rothstein's. You're a specialist in subspace, then? Oh, no, I'm not a specialist at all. I'm a dabbler, really. A specialist, is one who learns more and more about less and less until he knows everything about nothing at all. I'm just the opposite. I'm learning less and less about more and more, hoping in time to know nothing at all about everything. In other words, a fellow of the college. I'm glad you're aboard, sir. Oh, a theoretician. Barbara's face lit up, and she held out her hand. With dozens of doctorates in everything from astronomy to zoology? I've never met. I'm ever so glad to meet you, Doctor. Adams. Andrew Adams. But I have only 8 at the moment. Earned degrees, that is. But what were you doing in this life craft? No, let me guess. You were X-ray-eyeing it and fine-toothing it for improvements made since your last trip and storing the details away in your eidetic memory. Not eidetic by any means, merely very good. And how many metric tons of apparatus have you got in the hold? Destin asked. Less than 6. Just what I must have in order to... Babe, Jones's voice cut in. Course change. Stay on Alpha 18. Shift Beta to 44 and Gamma to 265. Rendezvous was made. Both life craft hung motionless relative to the Procyon's hulk. No other life craft had escaped. A conference was held. Weeks of work would be necessary before Destin and Jones could learn even approximately what the damage to the Procyon had been. Decontamination was automatic, of course, but there would be literally hundreds of hot spots, each of which would have to be sought out and neutralized by hand. The passengers' effects would have to be listed and stored in the proper cabins. Each body would have to be given velocity away from the ship, and so on. Every survivor would have to work, and work hard. The 2 girls wanted to be together. The 2 officers almost had to be together, to discuss matters at unhampered lengths and to make decisions. Each was, of course, almost as well versed in engineering as he was in his own specialty. All ship's officers from 1st to 5th had to be, and as long as they lived, or until the Procyon made port, all responsibility rested, first upon First Officer Destin, and second upon Second Officer Jones. Therefore Theodore and Bernice Jones came aboard Lifecraft 2, and Destin asked Newman to flit across to Lifecraft 3. Not me. I like the scenery here better. Newman's eyes raked Bernice's 5 feet 8 of scantily clad sheer beauty from ankles to coiffure. If you're too crowded, I know a life craft carries only 50 people. Go yourself. As a crew chief, you know the law. Destin spoke quietly. Too quietly, as the other man should have known. I am in command. You ain't in command of me, pretty boy, Newman sneered. You can play God when you're on sked, with a ship full of trained dogs to bite for you, but out here where nobody has ever come back from, I make my own law with this. He patted his side pocket. Draw it, then. Destin's voice now had all the top-deck rasp of his rank. Or crawl. The first officer had not moved. His right hand still hung quietly at his side. Newman glanced at the girls, both of whom were frozen, at Jones, who smiled at him pityingly, at Adams, who was merely interested. Yours is right where you can get at it, he faltered. You should have thought of that sooner. But this once, I won't move a finger until your hand is in your pocket. Just wing him, babe, Jones said then. He looks strong enough, except for his head. We can use him to shovel out the gum-cuck and clean up. I'll have to kill him sometime, and the sooner the better. Square between the eyes. Do you want a 100 limit at $10 a millimeter on how far the hole is off dead center? The 2 girls gasped, stared at each other, and at the 2 officers in horror. But Jones said calmly, without losing any part of his smile, I don't want a dime's worth of that. I've lost too much money that way already. At which outrageous statement both girls knew what was going on and smiled in relief. And Newman misinterpreted those smiles completely, especially Bernice's. The words came hard, but he managed to say then, I crawl. Crawl what? I crawl, sir. You want my gun? Keep it. There's a lot more difference than that between us. How close can you count seconds? Plus or minus 5%, sir. Close enough. Your first job will be to build some kind of a brute force belt or gear thing to act as a clock. You will really work. Any more insubordination or any malingering at all, and I'll put you into a life craft and launch you into space where you can make your own laws and be monarch of all you survey. Dismissed. Now flit. Newman flitted, fast, and Barbara, turning to her husband, opened her mouth to speak and shut it. No, he would have killed the man. He would have had to. He still might have to. Wherefore she said instead, "Why'd you let him keep his pistol? The slime? And after you actually saved his life, too." With some people, what's past doesn't count. The other was just a gesture. Psychology. It'll slow him down, I think. Besides, he'd have another one as soon as we get back into the Procyon. "But you can lock up all their guns, can't you?" Bernice asked. "I'm afraid not." "How about the other three, Herc?" "With thanks to you, Barbara, for the word, slime. If Lopresto is a financier, I'm an angel, with wings and halo complete. Gangsters, hoodlums, racketeers. You'd have to open every can of concentrate aboard to find all their spare artillery." "Check. The first thing to do is—" "One word first," Bernice put in. "I want to thank you, No, not first officer. But I could hardly—" "Sure you can. I'm babe to us all. And you're Bun. As to the other, forget it. You and I, Herc, will go over and—" "And I," Adams put in definitely. "I must photograph everything before it is touched. Therefore I must be the first on board. I must do some autopsies, and also—" "Of course you're right," Destin said. "And if I haven't said it before, I'm tremendously glad to have a big brain along. Oh, excuse that crack, please, Dr. Adams. It slipped out on me." Adams laughed. "In context, I regard that as the highest compliment I have ever received. To you youngsters, my advanced age of 52 represents senility. Nevertheless, you men need not doctor me. Either Adams or Andy will do very nicely. As for you two young women—" "I'm going to call you Uncle Andy," Barbara said with a grin. "Now, Uncle Andy, you being a big brain, the term being used in its most complimentary sense, and the way you talked, one of your 8 doctorates is in medicine?" "Of course." "Are you any good at obstetrics?" "In the present instance, I am perfectly safe in saying—" "Wait a minute," Destin snapped. "Bobby, you are not—" "I am too. That is, I don't suppose I am yet, since we were married only last Tuesday. But if he's competent, and I'm sure he is, I'm certainly going to. If we get back to Earth, I want to, and if we don't, both Bun and I have got to. Castaway's code, you know. So how about it, Uncle Andy?" "I know what you two girls are," Adam said quietly. "I know what you two men must of necessity be. Therefore, I can say without reservation that none of you need feel any apprehension whatsoever." Destin was about to say something, but Barbara forestalled him. "Well, we can think about it anyway and talk it over. But for right now, I think it's high time we all got some sleep. Don't you?" It was, and they did. And after they had slept and had eaten breakfast, the 3 men wafted themselves across a couple of 100 yards of space to the crippled starship. Powerful floodlights were rigged. "What a mess!" Destin's voice was low and wondering. "The whole top looks as though she'd crash-landed and spun out for 8 miles. But the middle and tail look untouched." Inside, however, devastation had gone deep into the middle. Bulkheads, walls, floors, structural members were torn, sheared, twisted into weirdly distorted shapes impossible to understand or explain. And much worse were the absences. For in dozens of volumes, of as many sizes and of shapes incompatible with any 3-dimensional geometry, every solid thing had vanished, without leaving any clue whatever as to where or how it had gone. After 3 long days of hard work, Adams was satisfied. He had taken pictures as fast as both officers could process the film. He had covered many miles of tape with words only half of which either spaceman could understand. Then finally he said, "Well, that covers the preliminary observations as well as I know how to do it. Thank you, boys, for your forbearance and your help. Now, if you'll help me find my stuff and bring some of it, a computer and so on, up to the lounge?" They did so. The "and so on" proving to be a bewilderingly miscellany indeed. "Thank you immensely, gentlemen. Now I won't bother you any more." "You've learned a lot, Doc, and we haven't learned much of anything." Destin grinned ruefully. "That makes you the director. You'll have to tell us, in general terms, what to do." "Oh, I can offer a few suggestions. It is virtually certain, 1. That no subspace equipment will function. 2. That all normal space equipment, except for some items you know about, will function normally. 3. That we can't do anything about subspace without landing on a planet. 4. That such landing will require extreme, I might almost say fantastic, precautions. Although both officers thought they understood item 4, neither of them had any inkling as to what atoms really meant. They did understand thoroughly, however, items 1, 2, and 3. "Hell's jets!" Destin exclaimed. "Do you mean we'll have to blast normal to a system?" "It isn't as bad as you think, Babe," Jones said. "Stars are much thicker here. We're in the center somewhere, than around Sol. The probability is 0.9 plus that any emergence would put us less than 0.4 light years away from a star. A couple of them show disks. I haven't measured any yet. Have you, Doc?" "Yes, 0.22, approximately, to the closest." "So what?" Destin demanded. "What's the chance of it having an Earth-type planet?" "Any solid planet will do," Adams said, "just so it has plenty of mass." "That's still quite a trip." Destin was coming around. "Especially since we can't use more than 1.0 gravities," Jones put in. "Over the long pole and the women, you're right," Destin agreed, and took out his slide rule. "Let's see. 1 gravity plus and minus, velocity, time. It'll take about 11 months. "Just about," Jones agreed, and Adams nodded. "Well, if that's what the cards say, there's no use yowling about it." And all 9 survivors went to work. Destin, besides working, directed the activities of all the others except Adams, who worked harder and longer than did anyone else. He barely took time out to eat and to sleep. Nor did either Destin or Jones ask him what he was doing. Both knew that it would take 5 years of advanced study before either of them could understand the simplest material on the doctor's tapes. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Subspace Survivors by E.E Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The tremendous engines of the Procyon were again putting out their wanton torrents of power. The starship, now a mere spaceship, was on course at 1 gravity. The life craft were in their slots, but the 5 and the 4 still lived in them rather than in the vast and oppressive emptiness that the ship itself now was. And socially, outside of working hours, the 2 groups did not mix. Cleanup was going nicely, at the union rate of 6 hours on and 18 hours off. Destin could have set any hours he pleased, but he didn't. There was plenty of time. 11 months in deep space is a tremendously long time. Morning, afternoon, evening, and night were, of course, purely conventional terms. The 24-hour day measured off by the brute force machine that was their master clock carried no guarantee, expressed or implied, as to either accuracy or uniformity. One evening, then, 4 hard-faced men sat at 2 small tables in the main room of Lifecraft 3. 2 of them, Ferdy Blaine and Moose Morden, were playing cards for small stakes. Ferdy was of medium size, compact rather than slender, built of rawhide and spring steel. Lithe and poised, he was the epitome of leashed and controlled action. Moose was 6'4" and weighed a good 240. Stolid, massive, solid. Ferdy and Moose, a tiger and an elephant. Both owned in fee simple by Vincent Lepresto. The two at the other table had been planning for days. They had had many vitriolic arguments, but neither had made any motion toward his weapon. "Play it my way, and we've got it made, I tell you." Newman pounded the table with his fist. 70 million if it's a cent. Heavier grease than your lousy spring syndicate had ever heard of. I'm as good an astrogator as Jones is, and a damn sight better engineer. In electronics, I maybe ain't got the theory Purdy Boy has, but at building and repairing the stuff, I've forgotten more than he ever will know. At practical stuff, and that's all we give a whoop about, I lay over both them sissies like a lunar dome. "Oh, yeah?" Lepresto sneered. "How come you aren't ticketed for Subspace, then?" "For hell's sake, act your age!" Newman snorted in disgust. Eyes locked and held, but nothing happened. "Do you think I'm dumb? Or that them Subspace Boy Scouts can be fixed? Or I don't know where the heavy grease is at? Or I can't make the approach? Why ain't you in Subspace?" "I see." Lepresto forced his anger down. "But I've got to be sure we can get back without 'em." "You can be damn sure. I got to get back myself, don't I? But I get one thing down solid. I get the big peroxide blonde." "You can have her. Too big. I like the little yellowhead a lot better." Newman sneered into the hard-held face so close to his and said, "And don't think for a second you can make me crawl, you small-time chiseling punk. Rub me out after we kill them off, and you get nowhere. You're dead. Chew on that a while, and you'll know who's boss." After just the right amount of holding back and objecting, Lepresto agreed. "You win, Newman. The way the cards lay. Have you ever planned this kind of an operation, or do you want me to?" "You do it, Vince," Newman said grandly. He had at least one of the qualities of a leader. "Besides, you already have, ain't you?" "Of course. Ferdy will take Destin." "No, he won't. He's mine, the louse." "If you're that dumb, all bets are off. What are you using for a brain? Can't you see the guy's chain lightning on ball bearings?" "But we're going to surprise him, ain't we?" "Sure, but even Ferdy would just as soon not give him an even break. You wouldn't stand the chance of a snowflake in hell, and if you've got the brains of a louse, you know it." "Okay, we'll let Ferdy have him. Me and you will match draws to see who." "I can draw twice to your once, but I suppose I'll have to prove it to you. I'll take Jones. You will gun the professor. Moses will grab the dames, one under each arm, and keep 'em out of the way until the shooting's over. The only thing is, when? The sooner the better. Tomorrow?" "Not quite, Vince. Let 'em finish figuring course, time, distance, all that stuff. They can do it a lot faster, and some better than I can. I'll tell you when." "Okay, and I'll give the signal. When I yell, 'Now,' we'll give 'em the business." Newman went to his cabin, and the muscle called Moose spoke thoughtfully. That is, as nearly thoughtfully as his mental equipment would allow. "I don't like that ape, boss. Before you gun him, let me work him over just a little bit, huh?" "It'll be quite a while yet, but that's a promise, Moose. As soon as this job's done, he'll wish he'd never been born. Until then, we'll let him think he's top dog. Let him rave. But Ferdy, any time he's behind me or out of sight, watch him like a hawk. Shoot him through the right elbow if he makes one sour move." "I get you, boss." A couple of evenings later, in Lifecraft 2, Barbara said, "You're worried, babe, and everything's going so smoothly. Why?" "Too smoothly altogether. That's why. Newman ought to be doing a slow burn and gold breaking all he dares, instead of which he's happy as a clam and working like a nailer. And I wouldn't trust Vincent Lepresto or Ferdinando Blaine as far as I can throw a brick chimney by its smoke. This whole situation stinks. There's going to be shooting for sure." "But they couldn't do anything without you two," Bernice exclaimed. "It'd be suicide. And with no motive? Could they, Ted, possibly?" Jones's dark face did not lighten. "They could, and I'm very much afraid they intend to. As a crew chief, Newman is a jack-leg engineer and a very good practical tronist, and if he is what I think he is—" He paused. "Could be," Destin said doubtfully, "in with a mob of normal space pirate smugglers. I'll buy that, but there wouldn't be enough plunder to—" "Just a sec. So he's a pretty good rule of thumb astrogator too, and we're computing every element of the flight. As for motive, salvage. With either of us alive, none. With both of us dead, can you guess within 10 million bucks of how much they'll collect?" "Blockhead!" Destin slapped himself on the forehead. "I never even thought of that angle. That nails it down solid." "With the added attraction," Jones went on, coldly and steadily, "of having two extremely desirable female women for 11 months before killing them too." Both girls shrank visibly, and Destin said, "Check. I thought that was the main feature, but it didn't add up. This does. Now, how will they figure the battle? Both of us at once of—" "Why?" Barbara asked. "I'd think they waylay you one at a time." The survivor would lock the ship in Null G, and it'd be like shooting fish in a barrel. Since we're almost never together on duty, and it won't come until after we're finished the computations, they'll think up a good reason for everybody to be together, and that itself will be the tip-off. Ferdy will probably draw on me." "And he'll kill you," Jones said flatly. "So I think I'll blow his brains out tomorrow morning on sight." "And get killed yourself?" "No. Much better to use their own trap." "We can't. Fast as you aren't in his class. He's a professional. Probably one of the fastest guns in space." "Yes, but I've got I think I can." Bernice, grinning openly now, stopped Destin's floundering. "It's high time you fellows told each other the truth. Bobby and I let our back hair down long ago. We were both tremendously surprised to know that both you boys are just as strongly psychic as we are, perhaps even more so." "Oh, so you get hunches too?" Jones demanded. "So you'll have plenty of warning?" "All my life. The old alarm clock has never failed me yet, but the girls can't start packing pistols now." "I wouldn't know how to shoot one if I did." Bernice laughed. "I'll throw things. I'm very good at that." "Huh?" Jones asked. He didn't know his new wife very well either. "What can you throw straight enough to do any good?" "Anything I can reach," she replied confidently. "Baseballs, medicine balls, cannonballs, rocks, bricks, darts, discus, hammer, javelin, what have you. In a four-wheel battle, I'd prefer chairs, I think. Flying chairs are really hard to cope with. Knives are, too. I'd much rather have you fellows do the actual executing. I'll start wearing a couple of knives in leg sheaths, but I won't throw 'em or use 'em unless I absolutely have to. So who will I knock out with the first chair?" "I'll answer that," Barbara said quietly. "If it's Blaine against Babe, it'll be Lepresto against Herc. So you'll throw your chairs, or whatever, at that unspeakable oaf Newman. I'd rather brain him than anyone else I know. But that would leave that gigantic gorilla to—why, he'd— Listen, you'll simply have to go armed." "I always do." Barbara held out her hands. "Since they don't want to shoot us two, yet, these are all the weapons I'll need." "Against a mountain man like that? You're that good? Really?" "Especially against a mountain man like that. I'm that good. Really." And both Joneses began to realize what Destin already knew, just how deadly those harmless-seeming weapons could be. Barbara went on. "We should have a signal, in case one of us gets warning first. Something that wouldn't mean anything to them. Musical, say, Brahms. That's it. The very instant any one of us feels their intent to signal their attack, he yells Brahms, and we all beat them to the punch. Okay? It was okay, and the four, Adams was still hard at work in the lounge, went to bed. And 3 days later, within an hour after the last flight Dontum had been put in the tank, the four intended victims allowed themselves to be inveigled into the lounge. Everything was peaceful. Everyone was full of friendship and brotherly love. But suddenly, Brahms rang out, with four voices in absolute unison, followed a moment later by Lepresto's stentorial, "Now." It was a very good thing that Destin had had ample warning, for he was indeed competing out of his class. As it was, his bullet crashed through Blaine's head, while the gunmen's went harmlessly into the carpet. The other pistol duel wasn't even close. Lopresto's hand barely touched his gun. Bernice, even while shrieking the battle cry, leaped to her feet, hurdled her chair, and reached for another. But one chair was enough. That fiercely but accurately sped missile knocked the half-drawn pistol from Newman's hand and sent his body crashing to the floor, where Destin's second bullet made it certain that he would not recover consciousness. Barbara's hand-to-hand engagement took about 1 second longer. Moose Morden was big and strong, and, for such a big man, was fairly fast physically. If he had had time to get his muscles ready, he might have had a chance. His thought processes, however, were lamentably slow, and Barbara Warner Destin was almost as fast physically as she was mentally. Thus, she reached him before he even began to realize that this pint-sized girl actually intended to hit him, and thus it was that his belly muscles were still completely relaxed when her small but extremely hard left fist sank half forearm deep into his solar plexus. With an agonized whoosh, he began to double up, but she scarcely allowed him to bend. Her right hand, fingers tightly bunched, was already boring savagely into a selected spot at the base of his neck. Then, left hand at his throat and right hand pulling hard at his belt, she put the totalizing and concentrated power of her whole body behind the knee she drove into his groin. That ended it. The big man could very well have been dying on his feet. To make sure, however, or to keep the girl from knowing that she had killed a man, Destin and Jones each put a bullet through the falling head before it struck the rug. Both girls flung themselves, sobbing, into their husbands' arms. The whole battle had lasted only a few seconds. Adams, although he had seen almost everything, had been concentrating so deeply that it took those few seconds for him to actually realize what was going on. He got up, felt of Newman's head, then looked casually at the other three bodies. "Oh, I killed him, Carl," Barbara sobbed convulsively. "And the worst of it is, I really meant to. I never did anything like that before in my whole life." "You didn't kill him, Barbara," Adams said. "Huh?" She raised her head from Destin's shoulder. The contrast between her streaming eyes and the relief dawning over her whole face was almost funny. "Why, I did the foulest things possible, and as hard as I possibly could. I'm sure I killed him." "By no means, my dear. Judo techniques, however skillfully and powerfully applied, do not and cannot kill instantly. Bullets through the brain do. I will photograph the cadavers, of course, and perform the customary post-mortem examinations for the record, but I know already what the findings will be. These four men died instantly of gunshot wounds." With the four gangsters gone, life aboard ship settled down quickly into a routine. That routine, however, was in no sense dull. The officers had plenty to do, operating the whole ship and rebuilding the mechanisms that were operating on jury-rigged or on straight breadboard hookups. And in their spare time, they enjoyed themselves tremendously in becoming better and better acquainted with their wives. For Bernice and Jones, like Barbara and Destin, had for each other an infinite number of endless vistas of personality, the exploration of which was sheerest delight. The girls, each of whom became joyously pregnant as soon as she could, kept house, and helped their husbands whenever need or opportunity arose. Their biggest chore, however, was to see to it that Adams got sleep, food, and exercise. For, if left to his own devices, he would never have exercised at all, would have grabbed a bite now and then, and would have slept only when he could no longer stay awake. "Uncle Andy, why don't you use that big brain of yours?" Barbara snapped at him one day. "For a man that's actually as smart as you are, I swear you've got the least sense of anybody I know." "But it's necessary, my dear child," Adams explained, unmoved. "This material is new. There are many extremely difficult problems involved, and I have less than a year to work on them. Less than 1 year. And it is a task for a team of specialists and all the resources of a research center." To the officers, however, Adams went into more detail. "Considering the enormous amounts of supplies carried, the scope, quantity, and quality of the safety devices employed, it is improbable that we are the first survivors of a subspace catastrophe to set course for a planet." After some argument, the officers agreed. "While I cannot as yet detect it, classify it, or evaluate it, we are carrying an extremely heavy charge of an unknown nature, the residuum of a field of force which is possibly more or less analogous to the electromagnetic field. This residuum either is or is not dischargeable to an object of planetary mass, and I'm virtually certain that it is. The discharge may be anything from an imperceptible flow up to one of such violence as to volatilize the craft carrying it. From the facts: 1. That in the absence of that field the subspace radio will function normally, and 2. That no subspace radio messages have ever been received from survivors. The conclusion seems inescapable that the discharge of this unknown field is in fact of extreme violence." "Good God!" Destin exclaimed. "Oh, that was what you meant by fantastic precautions back there?" "Precisely. But what can we do about it?" "I don't know. I simply do not know." Adams lost himself in thought for over a minute. "This is all so new. I know so little, and am working with such pitifully inadequate instrumentation. However, we have months of time yet, and if I am unable to arrive at a conclusion before arrival, I don't mean a rigorous analysis, of course, but merely a stopgap, empirical, pragmatic solution, we will simply remain in orbit around that sun until I do." End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of Subspace Survivors by E.E Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirk Ziegler. The Procyon bored on through space, at one unchanging gravity of acceleration. It may not seem, at first glance, that one gravity would result in a very high velocity, but when it is maintained steadily for days and weeks and months, it builds up to a very respectable speed. Nor was there any question of power. The Procyon's atomics did not drive the ship, but merely energized the cheaters, and the cheater effect engines that tapped the energy of the expanding universe itself. Thus, in less than 6 months, the Procyon had attained a velocity almost half that of light. At the estimated midpoint of the flight, the spaceship, still at one gravity of drive, was turned end for end, so that for the ensuing 5 and a fraction months she would be slowing down. A few weeks after the turnover, Adams seemed to have more time. At least he devoted more time to the expectant mothers, even to the point of supervising Destin and Jones in the construction of a weirdly wired device by means of which he studied and photographed the unborn child each woman bore. He said nothing, however, until Barbara made him talk. "Listen, you egregious clam," she said firmly. "I know darn well I've been pregnant for at least 7 months, and I ought to be twice this big. Our clock isn't that far off. Carl said that by wavelengths or something it's only about 3% fast, and you've been pussyfooting around, hem-hawing around all this time. Now, Uncle Andy, I want the truth. Are we in for a lot of trouble? Trouble? Of course not. Certainly not. No trouble at all, my dear. Why, you've seen the pictures. Here, look at them again. See? Absolutely normal fetus. Yours too, Bernice. Perfect. No malformations of any kind. Yes, but for what age? Bernice asked pointedly. 4 months, say. I see. I was exposed to a course of embryology myself once. But that's the interesting part of it, Adams enthused. Fascinating, and indubitably supremely important. In fact, it may point out the key datum underlying the solution of our entire problem. If this zeta field is causing this seemingly peculiar biological effect, that gives us a tremendously powerful new tool. For certain time vectors in the generalized matrix become perimeters. Thus, certain determinants, notably all-important delta prime sub mu, become manipulable by... But you aren't listening. I'm listening, Pops, but nothing is coming through. But thanks much anyway. I feel a lot better, knowing that I'm not going to give birth to a monster. Or are you really sure? Of course I'm sure, Adams snapped testily, and Barbara led Destin aside. Have you got the slightest idea of what he was talking about? She asked. Just the slightest, if any. Either that time is relative, no, that it's so elementary he wouldn't mention it. Maybe he's figured out a variable time of some kind or other. Anyway, you girls' slowness in producing has given the old boy a big lift, and I'm mighty glad of it. But aren't you worried, sweetheart? Not even in the least little bit? Of course not, and Destin very evidently meant just that. But I am. I can't help but be. Why aren't you? Because Doc isn't, and he knows his stuff, believe me. He can't lie any better than a 3-year-old, and he's sure that all 4 of you are just as safe as though you were in God's left-hand hip pocket. Oh, that's right. I never thought of it that way. So I don't have anything to worry about, do I? She lifted her lips to be kissed, and the kiss was long and sweet. Time flew past until, one day a couple of weeks short of arrival, Adams pushed up to Destin and Jones. "I have it," he shouted, and began to spout a torrent of higher, very much higher, mathematics. "Hold it, Doc." Destin held up an expostulatory hand. "I read you 0 and 10. Can't you delouse your signal? Whittle the stuff down to our size?" "Well," the scientist looked hurt, but did consent to forego the high math. "The discharge is catastrophic. The energy equivalent something in the order of a magnitude of 10,000 discharges of lightning, and unfortunately I do not know what it is. It is virtually certain, however, that we will be able to dissipate it in successive decrements by use of long, thin leads extending toward a high point of the planet." "Wire, you mean? What kind?" "The material is not important, except that it should have sufficient tensile strength to support as many miles as possible of its own length." "We've got dozens of coils of hookup wire," Destin said, "but not too many miles, and it's soft stuff." "Gram wire," Jones snapped his finger. "Of course," Destin agreed, "hundreds of miles of it. Float the sensor down on a Hotchkiss." "Tear out," Jones objected. "Bailey it, spidered out to 20 or so big flat feet. That'll take metal, but we can cannibal the whole middle without weakening the structure." "Sure. Surges, backlash, remote it." "Check. Remote everything to baby 2 and—" "Would you mind delousing your signal?" Adams asked caustically. "'Scuse please, Doc. A guy does talk better in his own lingo, doesn't he? Well, gram wire is a 1.3 millimeter diameter, ultra-high tensile steel wire, used for rewrapping the grams, you know." "No, I don't know. What are grams?" "Why, they're the intermediates between the cheaters." Okay, they're something like bottles that have to stand terrifically high pressures." "That's what I want to know. Such wire will do very nicely. Note now that our bodies must be grounded very thoroughly to the metal of the ship." "You're so right. We'll wrap the girls in silver mesh underwear up to the eyeballs, and run leads as big as my wrist to the frame." The approach was made, and the 4th planet out from that strange sun was selected as a ground. The planet was not at all like Earth. It had very little water, very little atmosphere, and very little vegetation. It was twice as massive as Earth. Its surface was rugged and jagged. One of its stupendous mountain ranges had sharp peaks more than 40,000 feet high. "There's one thing we must do," Adam said. "I have barely begun to study this Zeta field, and this one may very well be unique, irreplaceable. We must therefore launch all the life craft, except number 2, of course, into separate orbits around this sun, so that a properly staffed and properly equipped expedition can study it. Your proper expedition might get its pants burned off too. There's always that possibility, but I will insist on being assigned to the project. This information, young man, is necessary." "Okay, Doc." And it was done, and in a few days the Procyon hung motionless a good 500 miles high, directly above the highest, sharpest mountain peak they had been able to find. The Bailey boom, with its spider-like web network of grounding cables and with a large pulley at its end, extended 200 feet straight out from the side of the ship. A 25-mile coil of gram wire was mounted on the remote-controlled Hotchkiss reel. The end of the wire was run out over the pulley. A 15-pound weight, to act as a sensor and to keep the wire from fouling, was attached, and a few hundred feet of wire were run out. Then, in Lifecraft 2, as far away from the business district as they could get, the human bodies were grounded, and Destin started the reel. The wire ran out, and ran, and ran, and ran. The full 25 miles were paid out, and still nothing happened. Then very slowly, Destin let the big ship move straight downward, until finally it happened. There was a blast beside which the most terrific flash of lightning ever seen on Earth would have seemed like a firecracker. In what was almost a vacuum though she was, the whole immense mass of the Procyon was hurled upward like a cork out of a champagne bottle. And as for what felt like, since the 5 who experienced it could never describe it, even to each other, it is obviously indescribable by or to anyone else. As Bernice said long afterward, when she was being pressed by a newsman, "Just tell 'em it was the living end," and that it was as good a description as any. The girls were unwrapped from their silver mesh cocoons, and after a minute or so of semi-hysterics were as good as new. Then Destin stared out into the scope and gulped. Without saying a word, he waved a hand, and the others looked. It seemed as though the entire tip of the mountain was gone, had become a seething, flaming volcano on a world that had known no volcanism for hundreds of thousands of years. "And what," said Destin finally, "do you suppose happened to the other side of the ship?" The boom, of course, was gone. So were all 20 of the grounding cables, which, each the size of a man's arm, had found out in all directions to anchorages welded solidly to the vessel's skin and frame. The anchorages, too, were gone, and tons upon tons of high-alloy steel plating and structural members for many feet around where each anchorage had been. Steel had run like water, had been blown away in gusts of vapor. "Shall I try the radio now, Doc?" Destin asked. "By no means. This first blast would, of course, be the worst, but there will be several more of decreasing violence." There were. The second, while it volatilized the boom, and its grounding network merely fused portions of the anchorages. The third took only the boom itself. The fourth took only the dangling miles of wire. At the 6th trial, nothing apparently happened, whereupon the wire was drawn in, and 200-pound mass of steel was lowered until it was in firm and quiescent contact with the solid rock of the planet. "Now you may try your radio," Adams said. Destin flipped a switch and spoke quietly but clearly into a microphone. "Procyon 1 to Control 6. Flight 849, Subspace Radio Test 95, I think. How do you read me, Control 6? The reply was highly unorthodox. It was a wild yell, followed by words not directed at Destin at all. "Captain Reamer, Captain French, Captain Holloway, anybody. It's the Procyon that was lost a year ago, unless some fool is playing a dumb joke." "It's no joke, I hope." Another voice, crisp and authoritative, came in, growing louder as its source approached the distant pickup. "Or somebody will rot in jail for 100 years. Procyon 1 to Control 6, Destin said again, his voice not quite steady this time. Both girls were crying openly and joyfully. "How do you read me, French, old horse? This is Procyon 1, the Rund himself. Hi, babe." the new voice roared, then quieted to a normal volume. "I read you 8 and 1. Survivors? 5. Second Officer Jones, our wives, and Dr. Andrew Adams, a fellow of the College of Advanced Study. He's solely responsible for our being here, so skip that for now. In a life craft? No, after this long it must be the ship. Not navigable, of course. Not in subspace, and only so-so in normal. The cheaters are okay, but the whole top is spun out and the rest of her won't hold air. Air hell. She won't hold shipping crates. All the Wesleys are shot, and all the Q converters. Half the grams are leaking like sieves, and... Skip that too, just a sec. I'll cut in the downstairs recorder. Now start at your last check and tell us what happened since. It's a long story. Unwind it, Runt. I don't give a damn how long it is. Not a full detailed report, just hit the high spots, but don't leave anything really important out." "Wow," Jones remarked audibly. "What a man Frenchy. Like the ex-urbanite said to the gardener, I don't want you to work hard. Just take big shovelfuls and lots of them per minute." "That's enough out of you, Herc, my boy. You'll be next. Go ahead, babe." Destin went ahead and spoke almost steadily for 30 minutes. He did not mention the gangsters or any personal matters. Otherwise, his report was accurate and complete. He had no idea that everything he said was going out on an Earth-wide hookup, or that many other planets monitoring constantly all subspace channels were hooking on. When he was finally released, Captain French said with a chuckle, "Off the air for a minute. You have no idea what an uproar this has stirred up already. They let them have all your stuff, but we aren't putting out a thing until some brass gets out here and gets the real story." "That is the real story, damn it." "Oh, sure, and a very nice job, too, for an extemporaneous effort, if it was. Semantics says, though, that in a couple of spots it smells like slightly rancid cheese, and no, keep still. Too many planets listening in. Verbum sap. Anyway, the press smells something too, and they're screaming their lungs out, especially the Sob sisters. Now, Herc, on the air, you're orbiting the 4th planet of the sun. What sun? Where?" "I don't know. Unlisted. We're in completely unexplored territory. Standard reference angles are as follows," and Jones read off a long list of observations, not only the brightest stars of the galaxy, but also the standard reference points, such as Estoratus, laying outside it. "When you get that stuff all plotted, you'll find a hell of a big confusion. But I hope there aren't enough stars in it but what you can find us sometime. Off the air for good, I hope. Don't make me laugh, Buster. Your probable center will spear it. If there's ever more than one star in any confusion, you set it up. I'll eat all the extras. But there's a dozen big brains here, gnawing their nails off up to the wrist to talk to Adams all the rest of the night. So put him on and let's get back to sleep, huh? They're cutting this mic now." "Just a minute," Destin snapped. "What's your time?" 3:14:37. "So go back to bed, you night-prowling owl." "What day, month, and year?" Destin insisted. "Friday, French's voice was replaced by a much older one, very evidently that of a fellow of the college. After listening for a moment to the newcomer and Adams, Barbara took Destin by the arm and led him away. "Just a little bit of that gibberish is a bountiful sufficiency, husband mine. So I think we'd better take Captain French's advice, don't you?" Since there was only one star in Jones' confusion, by the book, Volume of Uncertainty, finding the Procyon was no problem at all. High brass came in quantity, and the entire story, except for one bit of biology, was told. 2 huge subspace-going machine shops also came, and 1,000 mechanics who worked on the crippled liner for almost 3 weeks. Then the Procyon started back for Earth under her own space drive, under the command of Captain Theodore Jones. His first, last, and only subspace command, of course, since he was now a married man. Destin had wanted to resign while still a first officer, but his superiors would not accept his resignation until his promotion, for outstanding services, came through. Thus, ex-Captain Carlyle Destin and his wife were deadheading, not quite back to Earth, but to the transfer point for the planet of New Mars. "Theodore Warner Destin is going to be born on New Mars, where he should be," Barbara had said, and Destin had agreed. "But suppose she's a Theodora," Bernice had twitted her. "Uh-huh," Barbara said calmly. I just know he's a Theodore." "Uh-huh, I know." Bernice had nodded her spectacular head. "And we wanted a girl, so she is. Barbara Bernice Jones, her name is. A living doll." Although both pregnancies were well advanced, neither was very near full term. Thus it was clear that both periods of gestation were going to be well over a year in length, but none of the 5 persons who knew it so much as mentioned the fact. To Adams it was only one tiny datum in an incredibly huge and complex mathematical structure. The parents did not want to be pilloried as crackpots, as public-seeking liars, or as being unable to count, and they knew that nobody would believe them if they told the truth, even, or especially, no medical doctor. The more any doctor knew about gynecology and obstetrics, in fact, the less he would believe any such story as theirs. Of what use is it to put such puny and trivial things as facts against rock-ribbed, iron-bound, entrenched authority? The 5, however, knew, and Destin and Jones had several long and highly unsatisfactory discussions, at first with Adams and later between themselves. At the end of the last such discussion, a couple of hours out from the transporter point, Jones lit a cigarette savagely and rasped, "Wherever you start, or whatever your angle of approach, he always boils it down to this: subjective time is measured by the number of learning events experienced. I ask you, babe, what does that mean, if anything? It sounds like it ought to mean something, but I'll be damned if I know what." Destin gazed thoughtfully at the incandescent tip of his friend's cigarette. "However, if it makes the old boy happy, and gives the college a toehold on Subspace, what do we care?" End of Chapter 4 by E.E. Smith. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Ogden, Utah. Voiceovers by Kirk.com. End of Subspace Survivors by E.E. Smith.